I try to say with my short bio that I'm a very bad maker, an engineer, and something of a long-term philosopher, so I guess maybe I'm a better philosopher. And I decided to do a presentation which takes the challenge of how we combine biology and technology to the level of what metaphors we use, and also to show you a prototype I was tinkering with because I'm very excited and interested in these new so-called blockchain technologies, and we'll see how that goes. Okay. Some of my experiments in the last year with the blockchain technology related to the Bitcoin, and we did this like I did work on how people build scientific instruments. So I'm interested in these open science hardware tools and what people do with these instruments, because they often employ it for like fun stuff. I'm so happy I have some young audience here. And this project actually continued in an interesting way this year because we decided to use one of these microfluidic devices, which are open source in this case, and to put a zooplankton, a little basically animal, and zip it with the electricity in order to dance and test the technology. But to do it through the Bitcoin by creating an account of that zooplankton, we even named her Daphne something, and you could send us Bitcoins, and then automatically the microfluidic plate will start, and you will see how we basically killed that poor microorganism. So this is like a type of prototypes I work with. Sometimes they're conceptual, sometimes they're real. Another one, last year here in Tel Aviv, we had a meeting at the Tel Aviv Makerspace around the issue of open science and blockchain. So I put my genome, I have a 23andMe profile, I put it on the blockchain, in the Bitcoin, in this part where you can authenticate data. So I can prove that's basically my genetic data. So why I'm doing this presentation? Oops, why it's not? Okay. Oops. This is not. I understand. Okay. So why I'm interested in this presentation? I have also used my computer. I'm basically annoyed by the abuse of biological metaphors for networks, especially when we have new technologies or new networks as the blockchain. And I actually see it as a form of, like a symptom that we miss philosophy in our discussions of technology, of discussions of change and conditions. So for me, basically technology, when it's excited, when it's disruptive, is like a philosophy by other means, basically. So, but sometimes it's just bad philosophy and also bad technology. So what I want to see is this return of the idea that philosophy is a form of disruptive technique, maybe, and it is the art of creating precedences, changes in the way we live, the way we think, the way we talk, the way we experience the world. And that's why I'm doing these prototypes, because I do believe technology is the way to do philosophy today. And for me, the philosophy is as important for design and technological innovation. And it's not about moralizing this technology, it's not just about being critical, but actually rethinking them as what they could do. So this is what I'll do now with you. I will try to make an argument why we need to bring together philosophy and design in order to prevent these bad metaphors. And how to bring together philosophy and design, there I'll present this Aspasia script prototype of my use with some collaborators of the blockchain technologies, and I'll show you something what is like my last will put on the blockchain, and I'll explain what it does and what I'm trying to do with that as a philosopher. Okay? So what are examples of a bad metaphors, and why we cannot leave basically philosophy to Silicon Valley? We cannot let this transhumanism and singularity university freaks which are just creating some form of a religious movement in the present, and I agree with Christoph that it's quite dangerous and it's also boring. It's kind of a return to some old style thinking. This is a good example of what is wrong with this discourse. It's Technium by Kevin Kelly. Yeah. Okay, sorry, I cannot. Kevin Kelly, yeah. He's one of the guys who started the Wired magazine, and he uses this term technium, where it's basically everything. Technium is not conscious at this point. They all have this idea that somehow from materiality we will end up in this amazing singular consciousness. It's always dematerialized consciousness. It always has this like religious undertones, and it uses a lot of complex language here to say that simple, almost Hegelian idea of the world becoming self-aware or self-conscious. And here the most funny part for me is also the end of the text where he says, so looking at the evolution of life and the long-term histories of past technologies, what are the long-term trajectories of the technium? What does technology want? So what is this next stage of humanity, planet, the universe? And there are a lot of things that sounds like from some New Age manual, like we'll become more empathetic, happy, la la la, and it ends up with this amazing sentence, it wants to play the infinite game. So it's even a bad poetry, I would say, at this stage. So, what is wrong actually with his metaphor of the technium? One worst thing about it, it's the complete ignorance of the current power structures behind the networks and the history of the networks. And even more, for me, the underlying biological metaphors, which are not even examined when he talks about the technium and creates these terms, which are very interesting for the interpretation. So I'll use two metaphors which I think are important and try to say like it's better not to use a term like technium, but to look into the metaphors which are already present in the way we think about technologies. So in my opinion, one of the most exciting, interesting metaphors are the metaphors behind internet and this idea of decentralized and distributed networks, basically. And there is a lot of the underlying metaphor is basically that the network something like a brain, that it operates like the human brain. And in several meanings, either it operates in terms of associative thinking, so that's the concept of the memex. So when we go to these early concepts, we have it. It's the concept of neural networks and machine learning, which is present, but also in the original idea that this TCP/IP protocol will be something that connects different parts of the network in any direction, basically, and it really works as our brain. So, the interesting thing about the blockchain technology is that it destroys this idea of the network, of internet, of the future technologies as this perfectly connected, that it's all about communication, basically. And it offers a very different metaphor, which is a bit like regressive or old style. It presents the network basically as a tree, or a tree in these cryptographic terms. And instead of the idea that it's all about moving the data from point A to point B via different routes, la la la, it's about recording the data of transactions, of exchanges, of interactions inside the network, and creating something like a strata, like a layers on which the recordings are done. So the biggest change, in my opinion, the interesting metaphor which comes to, nowadays, is this idea of the blockchain as something that grows and decays rather than only connects. It's a network that deals more with time, with transfer of value, material assets, rather than only with communication and these immaterial possibilities or computational concepts. So it's basically something like an internet with a history, internet with a memory, and internet which evolves, but in this material way, because the blocks on the blockchain are these records are basically part of the network. They cannot be, and the reason is because you want to create a system where you cannot fake or make recordings by your own will. It has to be the public ledger, basically. So these blocks of records on the blockchain are something like tree rings of all the transactions shared and forming the network. The nodes, the different nodes in this network have a history of the whole network. It is a copy of the ledger and they constantly evolve. So something with the blockchain, in my opinion, changes that whole idea that we are going into something immaterial, perfect, fast, I don't know, to these like Hegelian ideas of the absolute spirit or some Christian and monotheistic apocalyptic worlds. So it's something very messy, actually, something that has a memory and has these like layers. So what is this thing that grows in the case on the blockchain? By the way, I'm curious how many of you have a Bitcoin account or use these technologies? Good, we have few. How many of you ever heard of the blockchain? Okay, good, so it's not, I should have done that before. I may play a little video which will explain how it works better. But what's important to remember is it's a technology that is not about communication, it's a technology about recording and making a public ledger. So what is this thing that grows in the case of the blockchain? And it's basically these, let's say, blocks or hashes, basically, which constantly authenticate what goes on the network. And they're interesting for one reason, because they in some ways they're very reductionist. They change any form of a content into this arbitrary size of a fixed size of strings. But if I would use a metaphor, what this hash is, it's basically something like a container. And you don't know what is in the container. And what is the blockchain or the blocks? So this is a hash, let's say, and inside the block there are like many examples of these hashes which are on top of each other, or that's my primitive metaphor, and they're like these cargo ships which then can transfer, or you can do some different things of the data. But you cannot move their position. They're all connected to each other and they form that geological layers, we can say, and so on. So I was thinking about what are the metaphors we can use to describe the blockchain. And a metaphor I wanted to originally use, but then I changed my mind, is this Ernest Haeckel ontogenetic principle, which today we also know it's not completely correct, but it is this idea that ontogeny of every block recapitulates the phylogeny of the whole network. Basically, inside the node there is the ledger of the whole network, and it also takes part in the evolution of the whole network. That could be one, but I'm starting to like more this geological formation metaphor, where basically it's something that you cannot so easily like change, and it's basically like a sediment. So it is this idea of a network which grows, which has sediments, is visualized in a different way. This is what one example of the Bitcoin blockchain technology, where basically this block is on the top, let's say, of this block, or it's connected and defined through the transactions which happen in this block and then this. So it's a complex structure which has these layers, and you cannot fake it, you cannot copy it, you cannot manipulate it that easily, we have to add. So the one I decided to work with is the Ethereum, which is even more complicated than the Bitcoin, and don't ask me exactly what are these things, but as you can see, here are the layers. In every part of the block, there are layers inside the layers. So it's something, and the authentication of these layers and the network are done by all people that have a node and that are part of it. So what's exciting for me about the blockchain technology is exactly this, that it uses a metaphor of something that is not striving for perfection in materiality where everything will be connected, but has these sediments, that has this past, that it's like a historical phenomenon, not just some religious like hope about the future where everything will be connected. And of course it has its own like funny metaphors. So I'll skip this. So it has to have these sediments in order to make transactions and movements. You can see in real time the transactions that are happening. Here we see that on the Ethereum we have 1,489 transactions and exchanges for hours. It's like a week ago. So in order to understand how Ethereum works, because I couldn't comprehend all these like complicated graphs, I decided to do a little work. And because for me the exciting thing about this network is that possibility to die, that there has to be some dead part of that network in order to authenticate and make the transactions, the future transactions, certain, that it has this historical aspect. I decided to look into this issue of how can we die on the blockchain. And I used a very famous philosophical speech on the matter of death and how we commemorate death. It's the Aspasia speech from the Menexenus Plato dialogue, and I decided to do so-called smart contract on the Ethereum platform. I'm interested in these issues of death and digital media for some time. I published some things on that, but I somehow accidentally got into this topic, basically. But for me, the interesting thing about creating my last will on the Ethereum platform was this idea of performing and reflecting what is the blockchain, what are the possibilities. And I decided to use this famous Menexenus dialogue, like a speech by Aspasia, because she does like an interesting thing. She turns the whole genre of these funeral speeches or celebrations of dead soldiers, actually in Menexenus, on its head. And it's a very strong defense of theory, of thinking and words against actions, basically. And in this, Plato uses Aspasia, and Aspasia she talks in the name of the dead soldiers in that dialogue as a way to present philosophy. I have 5 minutes?
You have more.
Yeah. Okay, so she uses this speech and this reversal she does in order to show philosophy as the new disruptive tech, basically. Because what Plato had as an issue back then is that the myth and the rhetoric as a means of influencing the society and doing something interesting in the society were stronger. And there he comes with this like new way how to talk and how to act. And so I decided to use this dialogue, which I believe shows it in a very clear way where Plato stands or how he thought, and in some way it also defines what philosophy is as this new disruptive thinking in relation to myth and rhetoric, and to see how I would perform something like Aspasia did in that dialogue, or Plato did through Aspasia in that dialogue, and do this. So rethink how words, actions, my being in this case, relate to the packets and hashes which you use on the blockchain and on the internet, and to rethink the smart dialogue. So this is the original Aspasia speech, where she says, all knowledge when separated from justice and virtue is seen to be cunning and not wisdom. And the most important thing for us is to exceed, if possible, not only us, but all our ancestors in virtue. This is the dead soldiers are talking through Aspasia in this case. So they're basically complaining like, don't just celebrate us, but live the virtuous life. And for that she uses the words as a means of convincing the people that they should do these virtuous deeds, and not just celebrate the virtuous deeds. Because the fear of Aspasia and Plato is that by pretending we know everything, and by like being so obsessed with our mythical and rhetorical means of celebrating the dead in this case, we're actually not doing what we preach. That I think that's a short version of what is Menexenus. So how to connect words and actions with justice and virtue is the big issue for Plato, and how to exceed the past, how to move on. So in my project, instead of discussing the power of words, myth, rhetoric to describe the deeds of the dead soldiers, which is the main polemic between Plato and Thucydides, but also Aspasia and her husband, strangely, Pericles, who has a famous speech, or even dialectics and dialogues, which are these new means that Plato introduces, where he uses philosophy as this disruptive technique. We have suddenly these hashes and packets that in perfect smart contracts, they just trigger insurance policies, transfer accounts, and so on. So what I did basically in this prototype, I use her speech, which is a bit ironic even in Menexenus, and we can claim it relates to the origin of philosophy or what philosophy should be. And to use this Plato's dialogue, he uses it as a form of tribute for Socrates, which breaks the pathos of speech, celebrating soldiers, and introduces this new value of self-reflection, contemplative reason, but also dialogue. So for me, it became a question how to contemplate and perform my mortality and life, these issues of ontology and politics of the blockchain on this like new platform. And the smart contracts are important because they allow this connection between any things, any beings, and any institutions. They allow this form of, like, say, polylogs. So maybe the challenge was to, how would like Plato or Socrates use the blockchain if they had this technology? How would they perform this discussion about the words and actions? Do these hashes and packets we use, can they be a means of philosophy, basically? So this is how a contract, like a last will contract, looks on the Ethereum platform. It makes sense even to someone who is such a lousy programmer, and I'm very bad. It basically allows you to timestamp your account and to create. So what I did, this is the Ethereum node, which I used the Raspberry Pi to create like such Ethereum node where I have like some, I don't know, maybe 100 shekels or something like small like that. That's all my belonging right now. And then this is the part which I don't have, so I had to simulate it. I'm connecting like a variable which will measure my pulse and heartbeat. And I'm waiting for this angel sensor because that can send like open data. The rest of these variable sensors are horrible. So right now, it really exists. So my node back at home is connected to this guy, which has a sensor. It's a movement sensor inside. So if this moves every day and sends data that it's alive, then my last will not be triggered. It will be there just as a code. So this guy has something like an Arduino. It's called Particle. It's an easier one, easier than Arduino. So it just constantly sends data to that Ethereum, to this guy, which is hidden in my home, and it just tells him, yeah, she's still alive, don't do anything, okay? So I will not show how it works. Anyway, this is the contract, and the contract is if she still has her heartbeat on, if there is like some movement from this guy, if he sends data to a web address, then stay still, yeah? If there is no heartbeat, then what the system will do, I can send it around if you want to look at this amazing hedgehog. So what happens when I die? And I'll basically, this will happen. I'll just play it a bit. There will be a Spacia speech read on the blockchain. So I'll pay some AI on the blockchain to read a Spacia speech. And it sounds pretty creepy. I'm just putting part of that speech. So I will perform the smart contract on the blockchain, just as Plato performed philosophy, or his style of disruptive technique of discussion and self-reflection through the dialogues, and show the new means, or sing the means of virtue, justice, knowledge, and action, which I don't know what it is yet exactly, but it is about testing it and seeing also how the contract works. So just about the smart contracts, because that is the interesting thing for me, what type of philosophy they are, or what type of, how should we think of them? The people that created the blockchain technologies, which is probably this guy Nick Szabo and his Bitcoin, they describe it as a vending machine. Basically, you put the dimes, nickels, or something, and you get a soda back plus change. So you create like the conditions under which the contract will be executed. You can connect any machines and humans into it, and then there are these like hidden little robots, which are these hashes in the blocks. They just check whether everything is correct, like in my case, whether I'm still alive, and then just do it. Okay, so here are examples of such smart contracts, and people did prenup on the blockchain. There are these ideas that you can build a better democracy in 100 lines of code. But in my opinion, what's interesting about these contracts, they're basically something like a pact with the devil, or that's the old metaphor to use. And why? Because they introduced this idea of actions and connection across scales. There are some form of contracts and interactions with the non-humans which are automatically done, and they have these elements of this pact with the devil, which were usually some like a normal language words transformed into special codes and special systems, and they have this idea of an unequal exchange and gift between a human being and some form of a devil or something transcendent, and so on. So here is from the Faust book, where the important part where he mocks Faust, mocks Mephistopheles and says, hey, why do you want me to have this contract sign, why you don't trust my word. So something about the idea of a pact with the devil, that human words and human language is not enough for a contract, that you have to write it and sign it with your blood, is a very important metaphor in this. Then, of course, this is an example of a real supposed, this was used in the witch trials with Urban Grandier. It's an interesting story anyway. So it's like a reverse Latin and some special like signs. Interesting thing for us maybe here in Israel is that many of these pacts with the devil have also very strong anti-Semitic components. That next to the devil there was always some Jew, or there are always like some story of that. That would be like an interesting also part to do research on. But for me the interesting thing now about these pacts with the devil as a model for smart contracts is this. They connect unequal entities, ontologically, socially, legally. There's this tie between the here and beyond, between now and future. Yes, I'm finishing. So they create this social interaction reduced to objective proof based on something that is a blockchain. So to end up, this is my last position. I see behind the blockchain and behind the idea of smart contracts this idea of a magic and a ritual as in the hashing, I guess. This. And the question I would like to end up is, does the blockchain save the transcendence and agency of things, forces in the nature in the famous mouse dialogue, or reduces everything to sociality and interaction between humans? Does it enable literally becoming a slave rather than only symbolically owning ourselves to each other, which is the mouse interpretation and the idea of a Roman axiom? Are there some form of a metabolic codes that respect entropy? That's my last question about the blockchain. Thank you.